Hi, everybody. My name is Lenore von Stein, and this is yet another episode of The Facts. And The Fact comes to you. We're musicians, and mostly it's these music stories. And today it's another kind of discussion story, another story altogether. And it's the second part of a discussion with Johann, who wrote a book called Chasing the Scream, the First and Last Days. Look at that, last days of the war on drugs. And so, Johann, are you there? We're talking to him via Skype. He's in London. We're in New York. It's the 8th of August, 2015.
So great to be with you, Lenore. Thanks for having me again.
Thank you. One of the things we were talking, we left off before about some of the reasons that people become addicted to drugs. Since most people who take drugs will never become addicted to drugs or who use drugs in some ways, right? The vast majority. And part of what's happened in that war on drugs is that the bulk of the population is really ignorant when it comes to how drugs work and, you know, what happens when, and you mentioned the thing about hospitals and all these people taking opiates in hospitals. I was in an accident. I took a lot of opiates and I didn't become addicted to them. One of the things I remember in your book is talking of the many things is John Ball and Carl Chambers. Excuse me, I'm reading off my paper here. Studied that no one died of heroin between 1875 and 1968, and this thing of the history of this thing called the overdose. Can you connect the war on drugs to this phenomenon of the overdose?
Well, just correct slightly what you said in a second. That no one died of heroin withdrawal in that time. There were, of course, people who died of heroin use. But just to go back, we mentioned in the previous show, we had quite a serious drug addiction in my family, which was one of the reasons why I wanted to write about this. I wanted to understand what really causes addiction and what would genuinely help to turn addicts' lives around. And all the things I discovered in the 4 years I was working on the book, one of the things that surprised me, I guess, because it's so remote from my own family's experience, is exactly what you say. You know, there's something called the UN Office of Drug Control, who are the main drug war body in the world. Their official slogan is, "A drug-free world, we can do it." So it tells you where they're coming from. Mm. And even they admitted a couple of years ago, they were asked to calculate what proportion of current illegal drug users in the world are not harmed by that drug. So they don't have any health problems, they don't become addicted, they don't overdose. And amazingly, the figure is 90%, 90%. So yes. The overwhelming majority. And that's true even of quite hardcore drugs, for example, like methamphetamine, which really surprised me, but there's quite robust evidence on this. And I think part of the reason, this is not for a second to underestimate or to diminish the real harm that is caused to that minority, and they have to be at the forefront of our thought. And we have to think about what's different about that minority, and it's not what most people think. But I think that one of the reasons why we have this misperception is because it's an effect of the drug war, an unintended effect of the drug war. If you think about alcohol, right? If you go into a bar tonight where you are in New York, if I go into a pub just around the corner from where I live, look around, you'll see loads of people using alcohol, and the majority of them will be using it in a perfectly, good way. They're not alcoholics. Their life is being enhanced by, having a little buzz or chilling out a little bit. That we all know that about alcohol. It's actually true of all drugs. Obviously, to different degrees with different drugs, but the overwhelming majority of those users. And part of the problem is that we know that with alcohol because we see alcohol use all around us. You may well post on Facebook, oh, I had a great bottle of wine last night. You would be quite a foolish person if you posted on Facebook, I had a great line of cocaine last night, even if you did. Partly because, it could affect your employment. Certainly your people would talk about it. It might, someone might call the police, So part of them is the reality of normal drug use is hidden. It happens in the shadows. We don't see it. It would be as if the only alcohol users we saw were, a homeless addict a homeless alcoholic in the gutter, and that was our picture of alcohol use, that would obviously be a very distorted picture. And then which leads us to ask, what is different about addicts, and why is it, what's different about that 10% who do get into terrible trouble and do have terrible effects? And as we were talking in the last show, it's not about quantity of use, right? You can be a very heavy user and not become an addict. It's very interesting. There's a good illustration of this. Look at the Vietnam War. In Vietnam, about 20% of American troops were very heavily using heroin. And if you look at the news reports from the time, people were really, totally understandably, really worried, because they thought, my God, we're going to have hundreds of thousands of junkies on the streets of the United States when the war ends. What happened? Those addicts were followed home. They were studied very carefully. They didn't go to rehab, virtually none of them, a tiny proportion. They didn't go into withdrawal. They just stopped. Now, that makes no sense if you think of addiction as caused by the drug itself, right? But just like you said, you were given a load of opiates after being in an accident. You didn't become an addict. That's because you have meaning and purpose and connections in your life where you want to be present in your life, right?
Yes.
The core to addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is unbearable to you. If you think about that in terms of, forget the drug laws for a second, I've got a bottle of Volvic mineral water here. I'm sure you've got a drink in front of you. I'm sure the people in the control room have drinks in front of them, maybe a coffee or whatever. Totally legally, we could all have vodka in front of us. We could all be getting drunk, right? We've probably got enough money in the bank that we could get drunk. We could be drunk for the next month and we wouldn't end up homeless, right? We're not going to do that. And the reason we're not going to do that is not because anyone is going to physically stop us. On your way home, you'll go past a dozen places that sell vodka. The reason you're not going to do it is because you want to be present in your life. You've got people you love. You've got friends you love. You've got work you find meaningful. This is the core of understanding addiction. And one of the ways that helps us understand, if I think about, as we talked about in the last show, I went to 12 different countries. I covered 30,000 miles to sit with people whose lives have been changed one way or another by this approach and by the alternatives. And it was really fascinating to see this principle in practice. So I'll tell you about two places, just briefly. In Arizona, I went out with a chain gang of women who were forced to wear T-shirts saying I was a drug addict and made to dig graves while members of the public could jeer at them. They're forced to sleep in tents. Now, that seems like a freakish outlier. Actually, the entire American criminal justice system, with a tiny number of exceptions, that's the extreme tip of the spear, but, everyone gets the spear.
Yes.
And including, liberal place like New York City, I got to know people who've been in Rikers Island. Rikers Island, frankly, I'd probably rather be in Tent City, that place I went to, than Rikers Island.
Yes.
So absolute hell on earth. Now, that's bad enough, but what we do when they get out is even worse. So we then make it almost impossible for them to get back to the legal economy because we give them criminal records and so on. And it's, a doctor, a wonderful man, Gabor Mate, who treats addicts, said to me, if you wanted to design a system that would make addiction worse, you would design the war on drugs, right? Think about this, anyone watching this. Think about stopping smoking. Are you more likely to stop smoking the day you lose your home, you lose your wife, and you're humiliated and jeered at in public? Or are you more likely to stop smoking when things are going well in your life? What we do is we take people who are addicted because they're suffering and they're in pain, and we make them suffer more, and we inflict more pain on them, and then we're surprised they don't stop. Now, there's a place that did the exact opposite, and I think it's a place everyone needs to know about, and I went to see it in practice, and it's fascinating. In the year 2000, Portugal had one of the worst drug problems in Europe. 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is extraordinary. And every year they tried the American way more. So they arrested more people, they imprisoned more people. And every year the problem got worse. And one day the prime minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they basically said, look, we can't carry on like this. We can't have a country where more and more people become heroin addicts every year. What are we going to do? So they decided to set up a panel of scientists and doctors led by a wonderful man called Dr. João Goulão, who I got to know. And they said to this panel, go away, figure out, look at all the evidence, and come back and tell us what would genuinely solve this problem. And we'll agree in advance that we'll do whatever you recommend. So it took it out of politics. So after looking at all the evidence for a year and a half and going to loads of places, the panel came back and they said, decriminalize all drugs from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we used to spend on arresting and imprisoning drug users and drug addicts and spend it instead on turning their lives around. And it's interesting because it's mostly not what we think of as drug treatment in the United States and in Britain. So they do some residential rehab and they do have psychological therapy, and that does help. But overwhelmingly, what they did is the exact opposite of what we do. Those women I met on that chain gang, they're never going to work again, right? Not in the legal economy. In Portugal, what they did was set up take addicts and create a huge program of job creation for them. So say he used to be a mechanic. They'll go to a garage and they'll say, if you employ this guy for a year, we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to make sure that every addict in Portugal had something to get out of bed for in the morning. And what they found is that as they had jobs and they had purposes, they began to rebuild connections, they began to rebuild relationships. And it'll be 15 years in a few months since this experiment began. And the results are in. Injecting drug use is down by 50%, 50%. Deaths from overdose are massively down. Deaths from HIV transmission among addicts are massively down. And one of the ways you know it's worked really well is that almost nobody wants to go back. I went and interviewed João Figueira, the top drug cop in Portugal, who led the campaign against the decriminalization back in the year 2000. And he said what a lot of your viewers, I think, are totally reasonably going to be thinking. Surely if you decriminalize all drugs, we're going to have all sorts of disasters. And he said to me, everything I said would happen didn't happen. And everything the other side said would happen did. And he talked about how he felt ashamed that he'd spent 20 years arresting and harassing drug users before this change in the law. And he hoped the whole world followed Portugal's example. So it's really important for people to understand this is not a fixed thing, right? There are decisions we can make. We used to be a country, the United States and Britain used to be countries where we had liberty for users and compassion for addicts. We stopped doing that. We've given that alternative approach a fair shot, right? 100 years, $1 trillion, untold numbers of lives, certainly hundreds of thousands. And it didn't work. We couldn't even keep drugs out of our prisons with that policy. And we've got an armed perimeter, right? There is an alternative. It is being tried in other parts of the world and it's working incredibly well. We can do the same. America deserves better.
This kind of, excuse me if I extrapolate again, this kind of meanness, this kind of deep meanness in how you solve the problem by socking it to people, punishment, 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 punishment. And it bodes the turning around on this. It seems to me it could bode well for turning around on other lame, mean solutions to problems, human problems, because this has certainly been a really bad thing. Something like 75% of the people in the United States are in jail for non-violent drug crimes, and huge, and the jails are a place that corporations are making money. I mean, it's not, these things aren't connected to each other. This way of running the society, who's cooking and who's eating, it's.
Yeah. This is essentially, I'm really fascinated by that. The question of, I think you're so right about this being a model for how we think about other things, because they're very densely connected. And I'm really fascinated by, I've been thinking a lot lately about how people change their minds. And I've been thinking a lot about someone I got to know well for the writing of the book, and someone I grew to really think is an extraordinary person. Lee Maddox was a cop in Baltimore and Maryland. And a really passionate believer in the drug war. Lee's best friend, Lisa, was murdered by what she believed was a drug gang when they were in their early 20s. And Lee signed up to be a cop to destroy the drug gangs, to get revenge for her murdered friend. And she was a really tough drug war cop. She would bust people just for having a single joint. But Lee is a really honest person, and Lee noticed two things over time. One is that they were overwhelmingly going, that Lee is not a racist. And she just noticed that they just only ever arrested African Americans. One of her colleagues, Matthew Fogg, said to his boss, hey, boss, how come when we do drug raids, we only go to the African-American neighborhoods? Why don't we, I'm pretty sure they use drugs in the white neighborhoods. Should we go there? And his boss said words to the effect of, well, yeah, Matthew, you're right. There are, of course, white people use drugs, but white people also get lawyers and they know journalists and they can make a fuss. So, kind of go for the low hanging fruit. So Lee noticed the racism of it, but Lee also noticed something as important in a different way, which is if you're a cop and you arrest a rapist, obviously the next week there's going to be less rape in your town. If you arrest a pedophile, you're going to have less abused children in your area that week. But if you arrest a drug dealer, you don't have any less drug dealing. Everyone knows there's someone else on the corner, frankly, a couple of hours later. But even more than that, what you actually get, and the Lee didn't understand this at first, is an increase in the murder rate, right? Which is like, oh, why is that? Why would you have an increase in the murder rate? But this is a consistent effect of arresting drug dealers. And what happens is, if you think about a corner in Brownsville or wherever, where someone's selling drugs, they have established their control of that patch through violence by fighting off their rivals through violence. This is how an illegal market works. It's how alcohol worked under Al Capone. It's not how alcohol works now because it's legal. So they establish that patch by violence and they maintain it by violence. And if you come along and knock them out, what you do is you trigger a turf war for control of that patch. And of course, that turf war will take the form of violence, and you get a lot of innocent people caught in the crossfire. A huge amount of these homicides in Chicago that we've been hearing so much about are exactly that, exactly where Al Capone was killing people, by the way.
Yeah.
So it's really important to understand that. And Lee, she was seeing her friends die. One of her closest friends in the police was killed doing an undercover drugs raid. And she just thought, I can't do this anymore. She'd gone into the police force to destroy drug gangs, as she realized she was the one keeping them in business, right? The whole system of prohibition keeps them in business. If you legalize drugs, and that means different things for different drugs, but if you move towards a legal, regulated, controlled system of drugs, you genuinely do bankrupt the drug gangs. Ask yourself, where are the illegal alcohol dealers today? Where are the violent armed alcohol dealers? Does the head of Heineken go and shoot the head of Smirnoff in the face? Of course not. But the alcohol hasn't changed. It's the system of regulation. So reclaiming it from armed criminal gangs and having it sold by licensed and regulated salespeople. So Lee quit the Maryland PD. She retrained as a lawyer. She now works getting the convictions of people like the people she arrested quashed, and is an extraordinary campaigner for ending the war on drugs. And I think the more people can see those connections with, exactly as you say, with race, this is a profoundly racist system. Even when the individuals are not racist, like Lee and Matthew Fogg were not racist, the effect is racist. And a whole range of other things, like you say, like who financially benefits from this.
What about what's happening in Uruguay? What do they do in Uruguay?
It's so interesting. I went to Uruguay, and so Uruguay is the first country to legalize marijuana since the start of the international drug war, since Harry Anslinger, the guy we were talking about in the previous show. It's still going through their parliamentary structure, so the sale has not begun yet, like it did like it already has, obviously, in Colorado and Washington, the legal sales. But the story of how it happened is, to me, I think I interviewed a lot of extraordinary people for the book, and I think possibly the most amazing is Jose Mujica, the president at the time, the president of Uruguay. He stood down because his term ended. Jose Mujica was the leader in the 70s of a group called the Tupamaros, who were a kind of guerrilla movement, a left-wing guerrilla movement, trying to stop the imposition of a dictatorship in Uruguay. And so they would do things like steal food trucks and give the food to the poor. And President Mujica was caught by the dictatorship. He was kept at the bottom of a well for 2.5 years. Didn't see anyone, didn't speak to anyone. There were several of these dissidents who were kept at the bottom of wells. A lot of them went completely insane. President Mujica emerged from this well and became elected the president of Uruguay and lived in a shack. Well, the whole time he was president, I went to the shack. It really is a shack. I mean, like, no joke, George Bush wouldn't keep his shoes in the place where President Mujica lived. And he really saw the importance of ending the drug war, because he was very conscious. Think about housing projects in Queens, where you grew up, right? If you've got a housing project I know you didn't grow up in a housing project in Queens.
I grew up in a housing project.
You think about, like, if that housing project in Queens, if say 5 to 10% of the economy of that housing project is in the hands of armed criminal gangs selling drugs, that's going to be a miserable place to live, right? Because there's going to be a lot of violence and intimidation that you have to do to protect an illegal trade. Now imagine that it was 70% of the economy, right? That's the situation in northern Mexico, where I went to report from, to Ciudad Juarez, which is one of the deadliest cities in the world at the time. It's unlivable. What it means is the armed criminal gangs can act with complete impunity. They can buy the police. They can destroy the whole place, which is exactly what's happened in northern Mexico. About 160 people have been killed or disappeared in the last 8 years. And President Mujica was very conscious. Look, they went through this big fight in Uruguay to win democracy. It was a hard fight. It's not easy being at the bottom of a well for 2.5 years. And he was very conscious. Drug supply routes shift around the whole time, right? If the drug supply route that runs up through Colombia, from Colombia into Mexico and then into the United States, if that shifts, and it does sometimes, if it had shifted to go through Uruguay, I mean, what can they do to defend themselves? In Mexico, which is a big city with a big country with a big military, couldn't defend itself. He was very conscious that Uruguay, which is a country of 3.5 million people with a very weak army, that they would be powerless and the country would be destroyed and the democracy would be destroyed. So he wanted to begin the process of bringing these trades under legal control, reclaiming them from these armed criminal cartels and bankrupting these criminal cartels. Because it's nothing to do with the drug, the violence that is, sometimes you hear this phrase, drug-related violence. And what that sounds like is it sounds like people are using the drug, going crazy and killing people. That's what you think of when you hear that phrase. Actually, only a tiny fraction, 7% of drug-related violence is that. The rest is, the overwhelming majority of the rest is armed criminal gangs fighting for control of the patch. Well, that's got nothing to do with the drugs, right? Al Capone wasn't getting drunk and killing people. He was fighting to control a prohibited market in alcohol. As soon as you end the prohibition, all that violence ends. So that's what President Mujica wanted to explain, and that's why he began the process of legalizing marijuana and actually wanted to go further and legalize other drugs as well. And he's just such an amazing, poetic. People could hear on the website, www.chasing the Scream, the book's website, extracts, audio clips from my interviews with him, and Mujica is a remarkable man.
Yes, he does seem to be. He's special. No, special.
Yeah.
And in Switzerland, they also did something about. They've also dealt with drugs in a different way, right? And we have a few states in the United States that are beginning to at least deal with marijuana in a different way. The West Coast is, yeah.
Yeah, totally. It's very interesting that what happened in Switzerland is fascinating. I'm a Swiss citizen as well as a British citizen through my dad. My dad's from Switzerland. And I went there, and it's very interesting, and I think really relevant to the debate in the United States, how they won the argument for legalizing heroin in Switzerland. Switzerland is an extremely conservative country. My poor grandmother didn't get the vote until 1978, right? This is not San Francisco. And yet they voted to legalize heroin, and the way they did it is fascinating and really important. It was not through making the case for compassion for drug addicts or liberty for drug users or any of those things. It was a very different argument. And it was partly led by Ruth Dreifuss, who was then the president of Switzerland and also an extraordinary person who I got to know. And what Ruth and others explained was, look, people think legalization means anarchy. What we have now with the drug war is anarchy. Unknown criminals sell unknown chemicals to unknown users, all in the dark. Legalization is a way of restoring order to this anarchy. It means you bankrupt the criminals. It means you stop disease spreading. It means they no longer be unknown chemicals. They're safe, and they are chemicals that are as safe as possible and regulated and tested for their safety. And the addicts come into nice, clean clinics instead of being chaotic out on the streets. That was the argument that won the legalization of heroin in Switzerland. And they voted twice in referenda to legalize heroin by 70%, partly because when you saw the results, they were really unanswerable. There was, I think, the exact figures are in the book, but I think the figure was a 93% fall in burglary. Street prostitution just ended. It doesn't happen anymore. You know how many deaths from heroin overdoses they've had since they started doing this? 0. I don't even mean 0%, so rounding down to 0. I mean, none. There haven't been any.
So the United States would have to have this longing for order that the Swiss have in order to impart that, right? I mean, you can eat off the floor in the airport in Switzerland, right? But the United States is not. How are we going to do it?
Well, I think.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but.
No, you didn't at all. You mentioned before the Colorado and Washington. Actually, I don't know if you can see it, but behind me, I've got a poster of the Berlin Wall being torn down. And the only time I ever saw my dad cry, my parents lived in Berlin for a long time. My brother grew up there. And one time when I was 10, I came home and my parents were both crying. And I thought, my mother cried quite often, but my dad never cried. And I thought, oh my God, someone died. And they were watching the Berlin Wall being torn down. And my dad said, you don't understand, we never thought we'd live to see this happen. And when I heard the results from Washington and Colorado, the referendum results to legalize marijuana, I thought, this is the first axe into the Berlin Wall of the drug war. This is a really significant moment. And one of the things that's so important about the legalization of regulation of marijuana in Washington and Colorado that's been so important since is seeing how attitudes have changed. So if you look at 55% of people who voted in Washington and Colorado voted for the legalization, but now it's been in place for whatever it is, a year and a half. Year and a half.
I just got to tell you, we've got less than a minute to go.
Oh, sure. Now they've seen it in practice, year and a half. Support has gone up from 55% to 70% for it being legal. I saw this everywhere in the world when people see the alternatives to the war on drugs, when they see them in practice, they really like them. The things they're afraid of don't happen, and they see that models based on love and compassion and order work incredibly well. And anyone who wants any more information about the book or about to hear the interviews with loads of the people we've been talking about, if they go to www.chasingthescream.com, they can find out there, why the book is the only book that's ever been praised by both Elton John and Noam Chomsky, and lots of other people like Bill Maher and Amy Goodman. And so you can find out more about it there.
Thank you very much.
Take a quiz
Thank you very much. Thank you. This is Lenore von Stein. This is The Facts. To a better tomorrow. Adios.